In the following presentation, Professor Liah Greenfeld, Professor of Sociology, Political Science, and Anthropology at Boston University in the USA, talks about the translatability of culture. She addresses the nature of culture and the role of language in it, emphasizing that cross-cultural understanding is limited, as no culture can be fully translated by language.
The essential purpose of bilingual education is to increase cross-cultural understanding, to translate the experiences of one culture to another culture. So this is why I decided to dedicate my talk to this subject. I want to begin with my native culture and language, Russian. On several occasions in my career, I taught Brothers Karamazov, in my opinion, the greatest of Dostoevsky's novels. I had to teach it in English, and each time was frustrated by the inability of excellent English translations to deliver anything like the emotional punch of the message delivered by the Russian text. The inadequacy of the English translation, of all English translations, or of all translations into any other language, on the whole, as good as translations go, was the result of the inability of those other languages, including English, to convey the atmosphere created by Russian suffixes. They couldn't translate the suffixes, such as, for example, ENK, EHK, or just the letter S added to many words. These suffixes cannot be translated because, while an element of language, unlike language in general, they are not explicit, and meanings they transmit are completely determined by the extra-linguistic cultural context in which they are used. Nobody without the knowledge of this extra-linguistic context would be able to understand them. So when we are dealing with translations of great works of literature, we basically get parts of them. We never get the full work. The inescapable inadequacy of translations of Brothers Karamazov is just an example of the inability of language, the only means we have to transmit, thus express or represent culture, to express or represent one culture to another, or of the intranslatability of cultures and necessary limits to cross-cultural understanding. In a way, this is analogous to the inability of different biological species who may peacefully coexist, read each other's signs, and efficiently communicate, to interbreed, thereby crossing the biological, genetic lines that separate them. There is a limit, in other words, to the extent to which cultural experience can be shared, which is also the extent to which culture can be reduced to language. I must say that it is Dr. Fei Jung's dissertation, The Cultural Authenticity Effect, the Rhetoric of an Authentic Cultural Representation, in English children's fiction portraying East Asian cultures, which is currently transforming into a book, hopefully to be published by Harvard, that prompted me to focus on this complex relationship between language and culture. And what I now present here are some tentative propositions resulting from this focus. Let us consider first what culture is and what role language plays in it. Culture is not a biological phenomenon. It is not a product of evolution and thus is not related to what distinguishes us as a biological species, Homo sapiens, from other biological species. All distinctions among species are strictly quantitative, a matter of degree. Humanity, however, is categorically distinguished from the rest of animal kingdom. This categorical distinction has to do with the fact that while in the animal kingdom, ways of life are transmitted primarily genetically by genes, within humanity, they are transmitted primarily symbolically by symbols. Given that the word culture from the start meant what was added to nature by humans, it makes perfect sense to refer to the symbolic process of transmission of human ways of life as culture. Culture, therefore, just like life, is a process. It goes on, it implies constant change, however imperceptible, it occurs in time. While the processes of life depend on the nature of genes, for which every moment in time corresponds to a specific spatial configuration, the process of culture depends on the nature of symbols, for which no such correspondence obtains. Not having a specific connection to space, the symbolic process, though obviously real, empirical, is therefore not material. Culture is a reality, but not a material reality. A symbol is an arbitrary sign. In other words, it is a sign which is not a part of the phenomenon it signifies. Its attachment to the referent, that is, its significance, is not necessary, therefore changeable, and its meaning evolves with the context. A symbolic process, thus, is an historical process. Now, this historical process is actually happening within every one of us. It is in our individual minds, supported at every moment by our individual brains, that symbols are attached to reference and acquire their changeable meanings. The mind is the cultural process on the individual level. It is the processing of the symbolic cultural stimuli from the environment by the brain. In other words, the mind is culture in the brain. One can draw an analogy, for example, to the stomach, which is a processor of food that comes from the environment. It comes from outside. The stomach does not produce the food. The mind is similar to, analogous to the process of digestion. It is the processing of stimuli from the environment, in the case of the brain, symbolic stimuli, by means of the brain. So it is a symbolic process. So, from this we conclude culture, in addition to being a symbolic and historical process, is also a mental process, because it is necessarily and actually happens in the mind. Just like life, culture goes on simultaneously on two levels, the collective and the individual, which cannot ever proceed without the other and can be separated only in the abstract for the purpose of analysis. Just like life, culture is self-caused. It is a self-generating, self-perpetuating, and self-proliferating process. Both, in philosophical terms, are emergent realities, which cannot be reduced to the sum of the element or the underlying layers of reality in the boundary conditions of which they exist. This is the view of reality imagined in terms of incorporating the concept of emergent phenomenon. The fundamental layer of reality is material reality. This is the reality studied by physics, and the laws of physics represent the boundary conditions within which life emerges. The organic reality emerges. The reality of life cannot be reduced to the physical reality, but it must be logically consistent with it because it can only exist within those boundary conditions. The same applies to the next level of emergent reality, which is the symbolic reality, the reality of culture and the mind. It must be logically consistent with the organic reality of life and the physical reality because it only exists within the conditions of those underlying realities. But it cannot be reduced to them. It has its own causality and its own nature. It is a reality of its own kind. So, just like living cells being an emergent phenomenon, a few symbols will ever produce more and more symbols, which would organize themselves in systems. That is, specific forms of culture, just like cells, living cells, would organize themselves in systems, the specific living organisms. But there is this process, there's chain reaction. When you first have a few living cells, the process of life will begin and will constantly reproduce itself. And the same happens with symbols on the other level. Those systems, those processes, each with its own organizing principle, would go on both on the individual and on the collective levels, just as in the organic reality. The original form the reality of the mind and culture took was undoubtedly that of spoken language. Language lies at the very core of the culture process because it is the chief symbolic means of transmitting culture across generations, that is, long periods of time and large distances. Even today, preparing other elements of cultural reality for such transmission, we package them in language. Its impact on the life of our animal species at the dawn of our transformation into humanity must have been colossal. When knowledge about the environment had been transmitted by science, only the organism to whom a particular stimulus about the environment has been transmitted by science could communicate directly to the others and only to others within its immediate vicinity. Only direct learning, therefore, was possible, and the transmission of information about the environment, which was not genetically encoded and therefore had to be acquired through learning, was extremely limited. Language allowed indirect learning, and the acquired information expanded to the extent of rendering genetically transmitted knowledge about the environment superfluous, in effect replacing it. Spoken language was the original symbolic system, but no symbol and no symbolic system exist alone. In the presence of brain, they produce chain reactions and endlessly proliferate. And while culture is transmitted and communicated largely through language, it is experienced mostly by means of other symbolic systems. Undoubtedly, very quickly other languages, other symbolic systems must have been added to the spoken language, the language of visual images and body language above all. Our reality, the world we inhabit as human beings, represents a multidimensional fabric of symbolic systems, interwoven, crisscrossing, and diverging in most intricate ways. Because we are symbolic creatures, everything around us becomes a symbol. A bow, a glance, a smile, a handshake are symbols. It is on symbols of this silent kind that the nodal cultural structure of social stratification, the core of social experience in modern societies, for instance, rests to a far greater extent than on language proper, whether written or spoken. In context, a casual bow may signify a relationship of equality, a passing glance, superiority, and perhaps contempt, a forced smile, subservience. All these gestures may also signify something entirely different. The meaning of these symbols, making certain reactions adequate to and others inconsistent with an action that elicited them, changes with time, but also depending on the sphere of social life of which the gesture exchange in question becomes a part. Today, a casual bow to a sales clerk in a store would be adequate enough, but highly inappropriate to one's academic advisor in a corridor. The same applies to smells, sights, and inexplicit sounds, which can symbolize lower or higher social strata, as well as their class or ethnic or racial character, regulating one's actions in the environment accordingly. For instance, in the United States, the color of one's skin is a symbol of race and as such a determinant of very specific and important reactions which would astound people in Brazil, France, or Israel, where skin color has no meaning whatsoever and symbolizes nothing. The service of language as the chief medium of the transmission of symbolic information across generations accounts for the mistaken notion that language is first of all a system of communication. While not the least, this is certainly not the most important function language performs for us. For language also enables a particular symbolic process on the individual level, that is, in the mind. There, it is responsible for the existence of consciousness in its most distinctive human meaning of self-consciousness, which we can never ascribe even to very complex species in the animal kingdom. Half an hour of careful introspection will reveal to you that language is the medium of thinking. Thinking may be defined as explicit mental processing of symbolic stimuli. The mental processing, which involves not only the consciousness of environmental stimuli, in our case overwhelmingly symbolic, but also the consciousness of this consciousness. Whichever symbolic system occupies our mind at any given moment, if we are processing it explicitly, namely being conscious of processing it, we process it in words and may be said to engage in thinking. Results of some forms of symbolic processing may be recorded in symbols other than language, for instance, in mathematical formula or musical notation. But only a few symbolic systems have their own media of expression. complex symbolic systems of gestures and interactions, such as the system of stratification, for instance, or systems such as cuisine, fashion, politics, and so on, lack such specialized media, and to be expressed must resort to language. Thus, language intervenes in systemic relations of other symbolic systems. It has the ability to modify the significance of every other symbol. Clearly, other symbols possess this ability to some extent too. The meaning of words may be affected by intonation or gestures, as when one croons, caressing a pet, "Oh, you most terrible, horrible, bad boy," as it may be by a tune to which words are sung. The addition of the morpheme S to words in the conversation in Dostoevsky that I mentioned earlier plays a similar role. The morpheme, in fact, as many diminutive producing suffixes in Russian, is a tool of emotional intonation, an element of a body language, much more than of the language proper. Language does not express, but only signifies, points to the presence of its meaning. Symbolic systems that do not have their own media of explicit expression, that is, most symbolic systems, are usually processed unconsciously in the sense I just used, one not being conscious of processing them, not thinking about the process. To process them instead of using the mechanism of thinking, we use another of our mental ability, symbolic imagination. Symbolic imagination involves supplementing the information provided by our cultural environment as we navigate between numerous, interdependent, and yet autonomous symbolic systems, guessing the organizing principles of each and acting accordingly. Our mental life, that is, the process of human consciousness, consists mostly of such guesses, very rarely made explicit or analyzed retrospectively. Symbolic imagination probably is the central faculty of the human mind on which every one of its functions and its very formation and perpetuation depends, in the sense that all of these other functions and processes occur by means of symbolic imagination. One is not human without the capacity for it, but certainly not all humans have the ability to think. Because most of symbolic stimuli are processed unthinkingly, most of cultural experience does not involve language. Therefore, the expression of other symbolic systems in language, it must be kept in mind, is never an accurate representation. It is always an interpretation, therefore modification, and almost necessarily a reduction of a lived experience. Just imagine an attempt to represent in language Beethoven's music or Rembrandt's painting. Language can faithfully represent only what is originally presented in language, that is itself. There is so much more than language in cultural reality. Cultural reality is polysensory, with only a few of the senses involved having a corresponding medium of expression and representation. Language is the medium of thinking, of processing our experience explicitly. It transforms our experiences, that is reality, into knowledge, which then may be transmitted, shared. But the operative word here is transform. The experience changes form after a while being processed explicitly. It acquires a cognitive aspect and loses many others. Therefore, while language makes the world, including culture, knowable, it necessarily simplifies, homogenizes, and misrepresents it. No single medium, no, not even all the media available together can replicate, that is, represent, the heterogeneity of cultural experience. Presenting reality in language is already a misrepresentation. Presenting reality in language is already a homogenizing convention. Can language represent the smells of a kitchen, the sounds of a street, the pain of humiliation? One should keep in mind that a culture envelops us with sights, images, sounds, smells, and physical and mental sensations that cannot even be approached linguistically. That is, it can never be rendered explicit without losing most of what constitutes the experience. The problem would be unsolvable if not for our capacity for imagination. Thanks to this capacity, which we share with higher animals, but which for humans becomes symbolic, the huge gap between reality and language is bridged. Symbolic imagination, however, is formed in and presupposes familiarity with specific cultural contexts. It can fill the gaps between the culture in which it is formed and its language. Not necessarily, and in fact quite unlikely, between its language and other cultures. This brings us back to the problem of literary translation. The core symbolic system in any culture, language is still only one of any culture's symbolic systems, necessarily interwoven with and affected by them. As noted, it can no more represent the culture of which it is a part than any part can represent the whole. But it is a reflection, and the most important reflection, of its culture. Being a reflection of a specific culture, a part of a specific whole, it is by definition not fully translatable into other languages. In fact, to be truly proficient in a language, one must, to begin with, be proficient in its culture. What makes Dostoevsky or Dickens such great writers is far more than their mastery of Russian or English. Above all, it is the exceptional feel for the Russian and English cultures and the powerful symbolic imagination that goes with such a feel. A translator must have a similar cultural proficiency, but very few do. The tip of an iceberg does not represent the iceberg in any way beyond signifying one. It only suggests it. Similarly, language. It does not represent a culture which it signifies, but only suggests it. Precise translation is impossible because language implies much more than what it makes explicit. As I said before, Russian suffixes cannot be translated. They have meaning only to those familiar with the Russian culture. The most important thing is the understanding of the context. It is prior to the meaning of any one of its parts. Yet, translations inevitably treat parts as prior. They presume that if we understand the parts, we'll know the context. to turn this around. If language cannot represent the culture of which it is the core part, how much less it can represent a different culture? One needs symbolic imagination to fill in the gaps between the linguistic representation of one's own culture. One needs it at least as much to fill in the gaps between the linguistic representation of a foreign culture and that culture. But in this case, one is unlikely to have it. We can conclude that cultural translation is even more difficult than purely linguistic one. For this reason, it is much more difficult to translate fiction than scholarly literature, because in scholarly literature, language in fact represents our thinking on limited subjects, while fiction, great fiction at least, attempts to present us a culture to begin. So it deals with a much, much larger reality. Cultures are not mutually translatable, and language is just one part of it. And yet, this is a matter of degree and depends on how closely cultures are related. For instance, French and English cultures are more mutually translatable than either of them and the Russian culture. Russian and German cultures are quite mutually translatable. Different cultures may share certain symbolic systems. They may agree on issues of fashion, for instance, have common economic principles, common political principles, common view of social reality, or what constitutes a just society, even common view of reality in general. The least mutually translatable cultures are those that disagree on the most general principles, or in other words, cultures that belong to different civilizations, such as, for example, the monotheistic civilization, which we usually call Western, represented, let's say, by English, and Chinese civilization, represented by Cantonese or Mandarin, or Chinese and Indian civilizations. Now, this is how can we imagine the different levels of the cultural process that constantly go simultaneously, beginning from individual level of the mind and then on different collective levels, but this is all happens simultaneously. So, a civilization, it is a distinct, self-enclosed, self-sufficient, and self-generating variant of cultural reality that has developed over multiple generations, in fact, dozens of generations, multiplying in the process its interlacing traditions. It is an enduring, self-sufficient culture, borrowing from no other, with codified first principles resistant to outside influences. And it is a mega or meta culture, a mega or meta tradition, allowing for the existence of numerous specific cultures and traditions within the same set of first principles. So, it is precisely in the area with which you deal practically every day, the bilingual education, specifically the bilingual education in English, the language representative of a particular monotheistic culture, and Chinese, whether Cantonese or Mandarin, the language representative of a different civilizational culture. That problem exists in its most acute and intractable form. So, is there a solution? Is this problem of translatability of cultures, on which cross-cultural understanding depends, is it resolvable? My answer to that is yes, it is resolvable. But paradoxically, the clearer is our understanding that this problem exists, the better we are able to solve it. So to solve it, we must first be cognizant of the existence of the problem. We cannot bridge between those two cultures if we are acting on the basis of not being aware of this problem.